So, good afternoon. I'm Peter Mullner, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Materials Resource Sustainability Nexus MARESUNEX Seminar. Welcome everybody here in the classroom, and welcome everybody joining us remotely. I will quickly run you through the show of this afternoon. I will start with introducing our speaker, who will then give a talk of 40 minutes. At the end of that, we will have a quick break where students in the classroom will discuss some questions that will show up on the screen in their teams here in the classroom. Those joining remotely have the opportunity to go to a breakout room for a few minutes to discuss those questions with those who join that breakout room. If you prefer to stay in the big room, you are welcome to do that also. And after those 5 minutes, we will rejoin all together for a Q&A. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Faith Quigley, who is a third-year law student at the University of Idaho in the College of Law. She is currently spending her final semester in the Semester in Practice program at the United States District Court for the District of Idaho in Judge Lynn Windmill's chambers. She's also a legal intern for Idaho State Representative Annie Henderson-Haas, District 16, interns at Terra Graphics International Foundation. We have heard from them last week. Works in the College of Law's Criminal Appellate Legal Aid Clinic and serves as a research assistant to several professors for various projects. Ms. Quigley writes scholarly articles on mining, climate, and related corporate governance issues. She will sit for the Idaho bar exam this summer and will join the Idaho Attorney General's Office Civil Litigation and Constitutional Defense Division as a civil litigation fellow before clerking for the United States Court of Appeals. Ms. Quigley earned a bachelor's degree in geochemistry and environmental science at Olivet Nazarene University in her hometown Bradley in Illinois. She moved to Idaho for the mountains and greatly enjoys running and hiking here. Please help me welcome Faith Quigley.
Hello, guys. Hello, everyone I know online and everyone I don't know. Thank you for the lovely introduction. My name is Faith. I evidently have a lot of jobs. Sometimes I do sleep, and sometimes I talk about mining law, which is one of my favorite things to do. And I feel really honored to be able to talk to you guys about it today. So to give a brief agenda of what I'm going to talk about, I want to first share with you why in the world you're in the seminar, why this topic matters globally, but also why it matters to me personally. I think it's important if I'm going to share my views with you and facts that I've learned. I want to give you my ethos and why I'm even talking about it myself. I want to talk about how we got to where we are currently in the middle of a national energy emergency, a minerals crisis, a climate crisis. I want to share my perspective on that. Then I'm going to talk about how modern mineral supply chains work today. And that is a huge topic. I think I accidentally overestimated how much I could fit in 40 minutes, but I'm sure going to try to fit the overview of that. I'm going to talk briefly about the national energy emergency we're currently in. And then I'm going to talk through some more values-based trade-offs on global versus domestic mining in light of those things. And then we'll shift to discussion where you guys get to talk. So first, I'm not going to overly belabor the point on why this topic matters globally, because you guys have had several weeks. I hope everyone online and everyone here is well aware that we are in what I would call a minerals crisis. We are in a crisis of needing more minerals through extractive industry to support technology, which creates a climate crisis, which creates a need for more extractive industry. And it just kind of goes on and on and on. And that energy transition to what I would call climate-friendly energy, that's going to require trillions of dollars of investment over the next few years. And that is a problem that, looking around, a lot of you guys are my age, so Gen Z, it's a problem our generation is going to primarily be tackling. And then to shift to personally, I was thinking about Gen Z quite a bit because, you can see me, I'm 24 years old. I'm not a professional. I'm not a practitioner. I skipped a couple grades. That's how I'm finishing law school. But I haven't worked in this field very long. So I was thinking about what kind of perspective I can even bring to you guys, because a lot of you have probably had more work experience than I've been alive. And I think my unique perspective on this is as a member of Gen Z. I don't know how many speakers you guys have that are Gen Z, but I would bet not too many. And I think that that perspective is important for two reasons. The first is what I have detailed here, is that Gen Z has only lived through 5% of recorded history, but the amount of global data that we currently have is increasing like 90 times since 2010, and it's going to just continue doubling and doubling and doubling. And we have more data given to us every 2 years than in all of human history prior to the 2000s. That feels extremely overwhelming to me as a procedural problem and a substance problem. Procedurally, like I said, we need more minerals to support that amount of data. And then I thought about how that affects extractive industries. And I mean, of course, I'm scrolling on TikTok, right? And I'm seeing world problem after world problem after world problem. We're talking climate crisis, Iran, Israel. I mean, it floods you every single day. And I can safely say, working in the legislature, that brings it really close to home as well. And I was thinking about how we have all of this data, we have all of this need for extractive industry. I'm part of Gen Z. I feel overwhelmed with this task to solve this. What kind of perspective can I bring to that? And I realized that I think that Gen Z is uniquely positioned to tackle this problem. And I'm really glad there's seminars like this for that purpose, because we face every single problem every single day and every single notification on our phones. And I think that because of that, it's not just the climate crisis, the energy crisis, the affordability crisis. It's the energy, climate, war, politics, everything crisis all at once. And I think that Gen Z uniquely views the world as far more interconnected, especially to extractive industries, than the generations prior, because we get to see directly how extractive industries affect our every single thing we do far more than generations prior to us. So that might have been a bit of a tangent, maybe a soapbox, but I think this issue personally matters to me because I feel specifically empowered as a younger professional, but I also think that we're in a really, I hate to say it, exciting time of being able to tackle this problem in a way that generations before us haven't been able to. But we get the benefit of looking at prior generations and how they've handled it. And something I'm going to touch on is that this is not, we're certainly facing a unique magnitude of the problem, but needs like this for intense amount of energy in extractive industries have happened before. So how did we get here? I'm going to run through I'm trying to summarize a whole lot of history and law, so I'm going to summarize it in about 4 different things. So first, mining before the modern environmental era. And when I say modern environmental era, I would say 1970s, because that's when we got like NEPA, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the first Earth Day, things like that. So I'm assuming a lot of you guys know the gist of this, but mining occurred where minerals were needed, right? So gold mining in California, we saw a lot of mining in Wyoming, Idaho, Washington, even Colorado. We used to be one of the larger mining producers in the world. I mean, people moved from all over the world to California for our minerals. At the time, the legal framework has been governed by property law and resource development statutes. And the big one of those is the 1872 mining law. And I'm sure it's been mentioned before. It has been the crux of the last 2 years of my life. This law is a beast. But to sum it up, in 1872, we had this issue where miners were just digging things out of the ground willy-nilly and then claiming the property around it. And the United States government wanted to continue to incentivize this in a more structured way with more oversight. I don't think that was the result, but what they did was go to miners and say, what are you guys up to? What are your miner to miner standards? How do you guys interact with each other? And they codified that in the mining law of 1872. So this law doesn't have a whole lot. It essentially says that if you can pull a rock out of the ground that will make you money and you pay a little bit of money back to the government per year, you can have that entire swath of land. And that is the law that still governs all of mining law today, 200 and something years later, which is frustrating to a lot of different interest groups that I'll talk about. It's frustrating to businesses who don't feel like there's enough in it to really govern them. It's frustrating to environmental people who feel like there should be environmental protections inherent in the law instead of just in surrounding statutes. It's certainly frustrating to the United States government, which has to grapple with it. And there's been dozens and dozens and dozens of proposals to amend it, but none of them have successfully gotten through. So it is still the law on the books, but it doesn't cover a lot. And obviously before the 1970s, there was not really environmental regulations. There was minimal pollution control requirements. There wasn't a lot of law financially or environmentally around how to close a mine or reclaim the area. It was just, drill baby drill, I think is the term used now. But that was pretty much the motto prior to 1970. And this is a map that actually has been created by the Idaho Capital Sun that I was really astounded by. That is the estimated abandoned mines by state. So here in Idaho, we have about 8,800 mines sites that are abandoned. I would say most of those are in central Idaho, where I spend quite a bit of time. But if you look to like California, that's 58,000 abandoned mining sites. That's really intense. But then we got the 1960s and 70s, where we saw NEPA. I'm not going to belabor that because you guys have talked quite a lot about that. But we saw the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, RCRA, and each of these were kind of aimed at not necessarily reclaiming the land itself, but forcing companies to be accountable to the damage they were creating. We didn't get a lot of regulation around what companies have to do financially or security-wise about reclaiming the land until much later. And incredibly importantly, these did not amend the mining law, but they do supplement it. So the mining law does have a requirement in it that the government has oversight of these mines. And the way the government now enforces those is through these other environmental statutes. I always call NEPA the front door because the NEPA analysis and the EIS usually has to be completed prior to everything else, all of those other permits. But a mine now has to get over 50 different local, state, and federal permits just to operate. And I guess as a sub-point to that can create a lot of litigation. These are just some pictures from some of the oil spills, smogs, the Cuyahoga River fire, things that were happening prior to the 1970s. And that's the first Earth Day. I really love that photo. So this is where I find it interesting. I never thought about mining growing up. I grew up in Illinois. It just wasn't a thing on my mind until I really moved out west. I studied geology, so I thought about the rocks, but I never thought about mining, particularly because I didn't grow up in a state like Idaho, but America just doesn't have nearly as much mining as a lot of third world countries do. And I never thought to ask why. I just assumed maybe the rocks are over there, but that's not quite correct. As you can see, this is a map of the world's major mining sites. There are a lot more of them. This is just the major ones, and it's not even for everything. This was the most full map I could find. As you can see, we have plenty of mine sites here, and there's plenty of mine sites abroad. So it's not just that the rocks aren't here. When I've talked to professionals, as I've written other papers, companies after the 1970s, the Clean Water Act isn't cheap to comply with. The Clean Air Act is not cheap to comply with. You have to get experts to give you these analysis, right, on the environmental and social repercussions. I think Rachel shared really helpfully last week about that process from the tribal perspective, but I think from a company perspective as well. It's so much work, and it's just, again, not cheap. So a lot of these companies shifted abroad because it's mining, and it might be a little tougher to work with those communities, but it's lower regulatory costs. It's faster permitting timelines because you're not working as closely with a stricter government. It's lower labor and operating costs. You can pay people in third world countries significantly less than American citizens. And there's still those access to those mineral deposits, which is a rather unfortunate way to think about it, but from my perspective. But from a company's perspective, they're accountable to their investors, right? And if they can save their investors money and still get the same rock out of the ground, that same material, as the world was becoming increasingly globalized, this makes sense. So a lot of mining shifted over to Chile, Peru, Australia, etc. Obviously, geopolitics play a big role in that as well, our relationships with other countries, but that is unfortunately beyond the bounds of what I can talk about, but it's also really interesting. Specifically DRC. So I'm going to talk about two sets of consequences this had. There was a lot of consequences to this, but I have time for two. I think public health took the biggest shift. And that's just my personal view. I work with TIFO, the group you heard from last week, and a lot of their focus is public health. So that's been a lot of, I've been fortunate enough to talk with a lot of them about their experience with this. And I think the best way to sum it up is that public health risks shift where the mining goes, right? If someone's mining in McCall, Idaho, and they're digging up the lake, there's going to be public health issues there. It's doing it in another country. It's the same thing, except there might be a lack of resources, a lack of regulations, and a lack of health care to take care of those public health risks. So they compound, right? Things bioaccumulate generationally, things pass on. So we're not only seeing the same exposures, the same contamination, the same pollution, and honestly, the same like safety to the workers risks, but we're seeing a big issue because there's not the same legal framework surrounding those communities oftentimes as there are here in the US. The second set of, I have the wrong thing said there. The second set of consequences is for artisanal mining, which it does not say, but it should. So artisanal mining is the practice of smaller independent groups of miners in usually third world countries, oftentimes on the west coast of Africa or South America, and they're personally mining into the ground, right? Usually not a lot of machinery. It's usually like hand digging. It's what we would see 200 years ago here. And this supports 40 to 45 million miners worldwide. That is a large group of people. And it provides the livelihoods for quite literally millions of people. These communities are often reliant on mineral industry. So it's not like I can just say, well, we shouldn't mine there, because companies shifted there. That provided an economy. It substantiates communities and families' livelihoods on this. Artisanal mining is unfortunately a huge problem because, I mean, you can see from this picture, this is just a picture of a miner I found. You're obviously going to be far more exposed in those conditions than you would be in a truck underground, like here in the US. There's usually a lack of protective equipment, there's a lack of safety regulations, and child labor is not only documented, but from my knowledge and in reading, pretty common in these. I mean, there's not law around it. And I think maybe to take a forest for the trees perspective, but here in the US, I mean, we have plenty to complain about, right? I hear complaints about the legislature, about the courts every day, but our legal framework is really good compared to a lot of these areas. And when we shift mining overseas, we are supporting those communities, but we're coming to them without those legal frameworks to protect them. So in my perspective, law works. And I'll just give a brief comparison. I'm going to go more into how what we're experiencing now has happened before. But something that I've read a lot about recently is the 1970s oil crisis. And I'm reading a lot about that now, particularly from the events in Iran in the last couple weeks. I've gotten, I would say in the last 2 weeks, really interested in oil, but I usually like to stick to critical minerals for this reason. But we've faced a very similar energy crisis before. There was an oil embargo placed during the Arab Wars. Oil prices quadrupled, much like we're seeing now. This created obviously very long lines at gas stations, and there was this huge need for oil all of a sudden. And this was, from the reading that I've done, this was the first time we really saw extractive industries as critical to national security. Because there's a difference in extractive industries for my cell phone or, for whatever we need to do day to day versus the protection of our nation. And whenever you hear about the protection of our nation, that automatically, at least for me, makes me feel very like, wow, we have to do this right now. I want my children protected. I want my neighbors protected. And when we tie things to national security, I would say especially post 9/11, that automatically raises the stakes. And even in the 1970s, prior to 9/11, we still responded to this by creating a reserve of oil, which we didn't pull out of until 2022. We created national fuel economy standards. We expanded domestic energy production rapidly. And this is a really isolated instance, but I think it's really comparable to what we're experiencing right now of we're tying minerals to national security protection, and all of a sudden we need to have reserves. We need to bring supply chains domestic. We need to drill, baby, drill, and open up mines. And this is now being phrased as an emergent need, even though we face the same need for extractive minerals as we have, as I would say, since the 1970s. So turning to how modern mining supply chains work. And this is a hefty topic, as I mentioned. So I'm going to try to give a very brief overview. But essentially, I can break this down into about 5 stages. You've got exploration for those mineral deposits, which is usually when that 1872 mining law comes into play. You've got mine development and extraction. That's when a lot of those environmental laws come into play. Processing and refining. This starts to get out of my wheelhouse, but this is where you're sending it to a processor, chemically separating and purifying the minerals into their pure forms. Manufacturing turns those materials into things like batteries, electrics, or like small pieces. And then final products are when like Tesla turns all of this into a vehicle. And I want to give a case study very briefly of how this would work in actuality, right? So let's say geologists identify lithium-rich brine deposits beneath some salt flats in Chile, right? You're in the desert, you're digging, you find elements of lithium within the salt flats. So you're still in Chile. The company comes in. Sociedad, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, SQM is one of the primary extraction companies for lithium in the world. Let's say, we're extracting this lithium. It's just a concentrate. It's not usable yet. You just have a sludge. That gets sent to China. The lithium is then turned into battery grade chemicals. So it's still kind of nothing. It's still kind of a sludge, but now we're in China, which processes a whole lot of lithium. Then that gets sent to South Korea, where you're turning that sludge into batteries. Those batteries get put into battery packs, and they get sent to the United States, Europe, predominantly very developed countries, to be put into electric vehicles. That takes a long time. Exploration alone can take years. Mine development and extraction can take like 20 years in the US. I would say 3 to 7 years overseas, depending on litigation or that country's regulations. This all takes a long time. And I think there's this embedded assumption that if we bring supply chains domestic, it might take less time. I'll come back to that though. I think it's hard to like put this in a good spot, so I just want to talk about it now. Why in the world do United States companies mine overseas when foreign companies are coming here? That always was a question on my mind of why are we almost swapping minerals if there's all this concern about how long it takes and where things are going. And I just want to point out a few different things. So many of the minerals are concentrated outside of the United States. And like I said, they're in countries with less regulatory oversight. And that's not to say anything about the companies. I'm not going to make that assertion, but you're going to make a lot more money if you can pay someone $1 to mine versus $25 an hour plus benefits, right? It takes much longer to permit in the United States compared to other countries. I will say the report coming out of the Biden administration stated that the primary reason for that is because companies aren't forthcoming with information throughout the permitting process. But I will say multi-agency coordination does create substantial litigation risk that can open up to longer. Foreign companies mine here, in my perspective, because of the access to large institutional investors through those capital markets. United States financial markets do not contain the most amount of mines, but they do represent 40% of the global equity value, which means we have incredibly large investors here that are willing to invest in mines, very different than compared to other countries. So why not mine here if we have the deposits? Particularly if they're very certain on the success of that mine. Recent U.S. policies have also expanded financing for domestic mineral projects. The Defense Production Act provided funding specifically for critical mineral supply chains, and critical minerals are a designated list by executive order. The Inflation Reduction Act offers incentives for domestic energy and mineral development. Very similarly, it's not as supply chain focused. They're just differences in how we fund them, and I'm not great with money, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but they have expanded financing for those projects here. And there are laws kind of either way you go. No matter where you mine, you have to obviously follow the laws of the country where your mine operates. And I think that people think about environmental regulation, but this also includes labor laws, tax and royalty regimes. You need a very good lawyer if you're going to do that. International investment and trade agreements are something that I'm becoming more familiar with. Many countries sign these bilateral investment treaties, which protect foreign investors against unfair expropriation, fair and equitable treatment, access to international arbitration. It designates a court for if something goes wrong. I mean, do you want to litigate in DRC? Do you want to litigate in America? This offers protection for those investors. An example of this is through the World Trade Organization. United States laws, some of them actually apply to US companies abroad, which I found interesting. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prohibits the bribery of foreign officials in international business. So even if it's common, let's say in Chile, to bribe a permitting official to get your Clean Air Act or their version of it, we are not allowed to do that as American companies. We are not allowed to bribe that if it's in the course of business, which I find incredibly protective. There's also securities laws. SEC reporting is something that I've written quite a bit about. They're going around and around about like needing to report climate risk as a material risk, which will obviously substantially affect environmental risks. But public mining companies, even if they're mining overseas, must still disclose to the United States their financial and environmental risks, which, like I said, might include climate. It might also include those social considerations if those are material risks to their mine. There's also sanctions laws, which I think we've heard more about in the last couple years than we ever have before, but they do restrict business in certain sanctioned companies with certain actors. So the United States is watching over. There's also the National Security Review of foreign investment in the US. So kind of the other way. So the same way that we're watching, where we're doing business at, we are also watching who's coming here and mining. And the Committee on Foreign Investment can investigate those foreign acquisitions of land and minerals here. They can impose conditions, they can block transactions. The federal government can kind of just reach down in and handle the deal. So now to turn to what has also taken over my life the last couple of years, the national energy emergency. As I'm showing just a couple of headlines, I just literally searched national energy emergency and this is what all came up. It's obviously heavily in the news. There's a lot of different takes on it. What it means, if we've done this before, are we in the golden era? I think it was talked about during the State of the Union address. Are we in the golden era of America? Are we toppling extractive industries? I don't know. Something that I have not read yet, but I saw was issued yesterday. There's actually a court case right now in front of a federal judge, I want to say in DC, about whether the declaration of the national energy emergency is a legal use of presidential power. And all it said, it was just an opinion piece. I had no idea this was happening, but yeah, I'm excited to read that case because I think that would have pretty substantial effects on presidential power over things like energy. So stay tuned for that. To give the broadest overview, there was an executive order in the Biden administration that directed federal agencies to identify and secure supply chains for critical minerals. And critical minerals have always been a pretty consistent list. They're things like gold, silver. The Trump administration recently designated coal to be a critical mineral, which is a choice for sure. I wouldn't agree with that, but that will also change things moving forward, which I don't have time to delve into, but find me after. The big executive order was the recent one last year from the Trump administration, which stated explicitly, we are in a national energy emergency. We need to prioritize domestic production. Agencies need to identify projects for expedited review. That's kind of up in the air for what that means and whether that's legal. The way that has happened has been through what's called the Fast 41 program. So Congress issued an act called the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. And this allows coordinated federal permitting and expedited review for major infrastructure and mining projects. That's a lot of words. That means there's essentially a dashboard on a website that tracks different projects. And every once in a blue moon, the Trump administration will issue an executive order stating, I want this project right now. Not to say something controversial, but it reminds me of like a younger sibling being like, I want it right now, and I want it like now. It doesn't matter where I'm at. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. I need it right now. That's not really how law works. You can't just look at a mineral deposit and say, I want there to be a fully functioning mine that's going through all 5 stages of supply chain development. That's not how this works, but that is what the dashboard, in my perspective, is kind of aiming to do. And there's several projects from Idaho on that list. And just to mention the newest development that I did not include here is that the Idaho in the Idaho governor on February 26 signed a memorandum of understanding with the federal government, where the state of Idaho will now agree to have all infrastructure and critical mineral projects on that dashboard as well. So Idaho, as well as the federal government, any projects going on will all be listed on that dashboard, and that is intended to accelerate permitting. Have we seen this before? Yes. That made me feel a lot better. Kind of going back to the Gen Z is forced to face this problem, but holy cow, what do we do? We've been here before several times. So as I mentioned, there was the oil crisis, there was the oil embargo, the 1979 energy crisis, the Iranian Revolution disrupted oil supply, which created the Department of Energy. There was, of course, the post 9/11 energy security concerns. We're seeing here the increasing relationship between national security and minerals. Particularly in the Middle East at the time. And that was where we got the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which intended to expand energy production and infrastructure by primarily supplying funding. And then something that I hadn't really thought about as a energy thing was the 2022 shock, is what people call it. When Russia invaded Ukraine, that really disrupted energy markets. I know some of you probably read there was like the purported minerals deal last year. There's been a lot of talk about extractive industries involved in the Ukraine conflict. That was the first time the United States released like truly record amounts of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to keep oil prices low. I know I've been watching very closely to see if they'll do that again. So we've seen this before. We have seen this immediate need for energy right now tied to national security. In law, socially, from a president, we've seen this before, which I think makes me feel, I don't know if better is the right word, but it makes me feel comfort that we've seen this before, we've responded to it with law, we've figured out prior solutions that worked in some ways and didn't. We have things to look back at as lessons learned. So kind of going back to that case study, this is a different one. I did this on the Stibnite mine, which is also what I've spent the last 2 years writing about and working about. I just published a paper on it. The Stibnite mine, if you haven't heard, is a proposed gold project in Yellow Pine, Idaho, up by McCall. And this is what they are aiming to do, keeping a domestic supply chain fully here. They want to mine here in Idaho. They want to develop it here in Idaho, which might become the only domestic source of antimony in the US. They want to do on-site processing, which holds a whole host of issues because they want to build a processing facility with intense heap leaching at the headwaters of the South Fork of the Salmon River in a valley. So you're talking about, it's a valley near McCall, and you want to put an entire processing facility there on the headwaters of a very important river to Idaho. I have my own thoughts on that, but you can kind of, I'm sure, understand those. They also, what is interesting is they want to manufacture here in Idaho, or here in the United States. So the United States Antimony Corporation just opened a new manufacturing facility in Thompson Falls, Montana. It would be the only processing facility for antimony in the nation. So if they can pull that off, that would be interesting. And obviously those final products would be aimed to be used domestically and probably in our allied markets. So a lot of people other than China and maybe Iran right now. All that being said, where is mining actually happening right now? Right now, as you can see, this is just 2000 to 2017. We are seeing a boost in domestic mining, but we are still seeing a boost kind of everywhere else. So no matter what we're doing to try to increase mining domestically, it's still kind of happening the same. It's just happening more everywhere, which I also thought was interesting given, I think, just a lot of the news around it. I would hope that artisanal mining would be shrinking out of, health and social concerns. I would hope that we would be bringing ethical mining domestically in places that it's not going to substantially affect the headwaters of an important river. But truly, it's just happening more everywhere, except Europe. So this is kind of a values-based thing. There's a lot of trade-offs between global mining and domestic mining. And I think that people think of law and all of these considerations as just really intensely political and legal, and I think that they are. But I also think they're very values-driven, right? Because, I think mining overseas is a perfect example. We want to support those communities overseas now that we've helped them rely on companies overseas, but we're also forcing them to face contamination where they don't have healthcare to address it, right? So there's all of these different considerations. And to me, that's a very values-based process because in my mind, law and politics is just values put on paper, whether it's someone's money, someone's power, someone's thoughts. It's just values on paper. And I encourage you all, I don't know, maybe that's my contribution today. I encourage you to think about it like that. It's not just law and politics. It's really values driven. So from the corporate perspective, as I mentioned, and I'm going to go through various perspectives here. From the corporate perspective, they're accountable to their investors. And I personally don't hold companies higher than that, because I think once you start asking companies to hold themselves to public health and personal values and all of that, I think that gets really tricky, and we're putting more on them than they are. Companies are essentially, a piece of paper, a group of people that has decided to file under a name. They are accountable to making money. And in terms of that, global supply chains offer often a lot more money because you can pay people less. Permitting timelines abroad are much shorter. I'm sure even though there's laws on the books about how they go about permitting, I'm sure there's ways to get through them faster overseas. There's also access to those major deposits in areas with less regulation. Just in general, there's less law there, so it's easier to mine there. However, from the domestic standpoint, you have access to one of the largest economies in the entire world. There's federal incentives, there's tax write-offs. So you're really facing operating costs versus regulatory certainty and strategic demand here. And I think something new that I'm seeing companies really wrestle with is, do they want to aim to please the American public, which is, I would hope, mostly concerned for things like public health and public lands. I think no matter what side of the aisle you're on, I think most Americans care about clean air and clean water. And I'm seeing mining companies, honestly, like Perpetua Resources, which is the Stibnite Gold project, trying to figure out how do we appease that and still get through the litigation process really quickly. And there's a lot of really great authors on that. From the community's perspective, I'm kind of getting at NIMBY here. We have a lot of potential benefits. Like as small communities, I'm just thinking like in Idaho, large mines can create, honestly, I have 300 to 1,000 direct jobs here, but probably more than that. Mining wages are pretty good. We need blue collar workers. I have an insurmountable amount of student loan, and sometimes I really wish that I would just be in a mine hitting rock. I don't say that, but sometimes I think it. And they pay well, they offer benefits. Mining usually supports additional jobs. If you're thinking about coming home to your family with a good amount of wages, that stimulates the local economy. It keeps families happy. There's also concerns community-wise. We have a lot of abandoned mine sites that usually fall in those local communities, and a lot of them on tribes. And that creates public health issues, resource issues, regulation issues, local government issues, infrastructure issues. If you're thinking about even just like building things around that abandoned mine site, it's intensely dangerous. So you're really kind of facing, do we want to develop together or do we want to face those risks? The government is facing a tougher perspective, and I think I've learned a lot more about this than I thought now working in the legislature, because I always used to think, well, the government is just supposed to protect us as people, right? But every government, local, state, federal, is facing economics, national security, resource access, public health, public lands, kind of everything, because they're accountable to the people. And the people, I'm sure every single one of us in here has different values and slightly different views on every single thing. And how do you appease all of those people? When mining contributes a lot of money and a lot of jobs, but we're actually, national security-wise, our relationship with China has affected the price of things. It's affected the price of phones, and obviously things with oil are going on. We want to be protective of our American markets and thus our American people. Resource-wise, like I said, there's supply resilience if we're mining here, but there's also the certainty of deposits overseas that might be faster to get to. And then, of course, I don't think I can belabor, there's public health and environmental issues. And I think something that I've thought about a lot is that the MAHA movement, for whatever your thoughts on that, really has raised awareness for the health of the American people. And we do have increasing rates of cancer, increasing rates of pollution-related disease and food chain-related diseases. And the government has to think about that. Do we want to bring back domestic mining when we're already facing public health issues? Environmental perspective, I view this as accountable to the earth, but also future generations. I think after working with Rachel from the tribe a little bit, I think she shares really incredible sentiments on how tribes really look at that as you're working for 7 generations ahead of you, right? And I think that's so intensely tied to the earth. And yes, we have laws like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, but they're taking forever. So even mines that can support climate-friendly energy technology, they're still taking a long time, and there's a lot of issues there. But on the other hand, do we want to export our environmental and public health issues to other countries, to other communities? So kind of in conclusion, the real question isn't whether we need minerals, we know that, but what impacts should occur? Under whose laws should they occur? Other countries, ours? And who bears the costs? Is it communities overseas? Is it your neighbor? Is it not in my backyard? Is it someone in Yellow Pine, Idaho, but not in Boise, Idaho? Who should that be? And who should be in charge of it? Should it be Congress, the president, another country, the United Nations? There's so many different things. And as I give you my discussion questions, I challenge you to think about this from a values-based perspective, to think about this as though you're considering this quite literally in your backyard. Because I think in terms of Gen Z, this is quite literally in our generation's backyard right now, and we're going to have to take on that no matter what. And that's not just an issue of law. That's not just an issue of politics. You can't just walk down to the Idaho State Legislature and get an immediate solution. I can't go to Perpetua Resources and solve all problems. But I can think about this from what are my values? Who do I think shouldn't bear those costs of my values? And where should those impacts lie? Should it be me, someone else? How should that look? So with that, I will give you the discussion questions.
That was a lot of information and put it together from different perspectives, law, business, we people. I will talk about now these questions here in our groups in the classroom. Those who would like to join the breakout room remotely, the breakout room should be open now, or is opening in just a minute. You might join there, and in 5 minutes we'll be back here for the Q&A. All right, guys. Looks like everybody's back in the main room from the breakout room, and also here we're getting ready to ask our questions. Who would like to go first? All right, there is Jacob.
Howdy. So thanks for your talk, first of all. And so you were talking about the oil crisis and how the situation in Iran could develop to one. And I do know crude oil prices skyrocketed the other day. They've since fallen to, at the time of this class, $86 per barrel. Does that make you want to amend your stance at all, or what's your current feeling on that?
That's a good question. Maybe I overstated my knowledge of crude oil. I compare the energy crisis to the 1970s energy crisis from I would say a more political, social stance than a monetary stance. I would compare the sentiment of we need energy and we need it right now. We need it domestic. We need to have reserves. We need to make ourselves feel very safe. And I see that as like geopolitically, I see that as an isolationist perspective of we can only depend on ourselves. I don't think I would amend my stance. I think that there's a lot going on in the Middle East right now that is definitely beyond the scope of this talk. Happy to chat about that over like alcohol, but I think there's a lot going on over there right now, and I think it lends to this feeling of, I mean, I have friends in major cities right now that are saying, I wish I didn't live in like a, what do they call that? Like an intensely populated area right now. They wish they didn't live in DC or New York because there's this sudden feeling that oil prices are rising, and even if they lower a little bit, we're still, engaging in these conflicts overseas. And there's this idea that the way to make ourselves feel safe is to have energy and to have national security. So I would say I don't think I would amend my stance just because I think the social stance of it, like the geopolitical position of it, feels very familiar as those energy crises that we've seen before of I need energy, I need it now, I need to feel safe, and I need to feel isolationist from the rest of the world. I hope that answered your question.
Going off of what you two were just talking about, I was wondering if you think that there's a part being played in this all with like fear mongering and trying to create more of a division between countries.
Oh, that's such a question. You guys are good at questions. I watched last week and I got nervous for this reason. I think fear mongering is a big word because I think fear mongering implies that there's like the Illuminati or something up in their plane in the sky, leaving chemtrails, making decisions about what should be happening down here and making sure we're scared enough to want to get energy and give money to someone. I think that there's definitely that feeling. I've felt that. I think that there's certainly a large population on TikTok that feels that way from my limited knowledge. I I think it's so much more nuanced than that. I think it's so much more complex than that because in reality, we do need these minerals. I don't think we need them like right now, tomorrow, suddenly we need domestic reserves. Um, if I give the government and companies the absolute benefit of the doubt, I think they're thinking long term. Because like I said, these things can take, I mean, if you're looking from initial exploring of a mine to having a Tesla in front of you, that can take 30, 40 years maybe, in like worst case litigation scenario. I think they're thinking ahead, right? Because if we need all these minerals by 2040, we need to start yesterday on getting them. And if we want to be a leader in that market, then we do need them. And I don't think that's fear mongering. I think that's just reality. I think that the effective public relations way to go about that is to incentivize that fear. Um, yeah, so I think there's a difference between the fear. I don't know, I just think fear mongering is too big of a word. I do think there's a reality, and I do think there's a little too much fear around it. I think that's how I would separate it.
Thanks for the great talk. I had a question pulling it back kind of into Idaho. Um, so I'm curious with the recent Stibnite decision, obviously like that mine is uniquely suited to be environmentally destructive. It's a legacy mine. It's at the headwaters of a very important river for the state. Going through the like record of decision that the Forest Service made, a lot of the alternatives that they propose are things like oh, a different access road, or like we're gonna have public parking lots or things like that. None of them are like, hey, we should find a spot that isn't a legacy mine and isn't so uniquely suited to destroy an important ecosystem. I know there's like other deposits of stibnite up in Coeur d'Alene, which are like along I-90, so we already have pretty significant like population there, and we've already done. It's not a quite as wilderness as the South Fork of the Salmon is. So I'm curious why, from like a legislative perspective, during the discovery section of a mine, why we don't force companies to present several options for how or for where they could mine so that we can, instead of just saying like, oh, there's a legacy mine there, we can just like go start it back up. Like obviously that's the easiest thing for them. I personally think it would be better to have them do a little bit more upfront on the discovery side of things, and then maybe expedite some of the permitting processes on the back end. So it's a little bit more front end work, a little less back end work. Is that like, I guess I don't really have a question. Is that something that is being thought about, or?
That is a huge question. Okay, I'll give you context. I've worked on the stibnite mine, like researching and writing on the stibnite mine for a little over 2 years now. My partner lives in McCall, so we are very concerned about wanting to possibly raise kids in an area that could face unprecedented swaths of new pollution. I also, a person that works closely with TIFO has been an expert witness in some of the litigation, so I've sat in on a lot of that litigation, and it is they call it the model for like the future of modern critical mining. That is what they purport themselves to be. And I'm not anti-mining. The groups I work with are anti-mining. I'm actually pretty pro-mining among environmental groups. I think that there's ways to responsibly do it. I think I do agree to some sentiment that we should bring things domestic. I think that supply chain resilience is of course a concern. So when I think about this mine, when I say I don't think it should be built, I mean that pretty seriously. And I think you raised several concerns that are very accurate. Notably, in the record of decision, the most environmentally preferable alternative was not to mine. There is, and I guess I don't know how much you guys read on the stibnite mine. It's like my whole life, so I could talk about it all day. This mine is a legacy mine. It was an abandoned mine. There was mining on it until like 1990, and then it was just fully abandoned. And it cut off breeding grounds for salmon in the river there. So Perpetua came in about 2010, and well, originally they were Midas Gold. They're a Canadian-based corporation operating through Idaho subsidiaries. And they said, we want to solve these problems environmentally. We want to work closely with the tribe. We want to work closely with Idaho. We want to build like the safest mine. And this is why I said specifically, I try not to hold companies accountable to public health or environmental concerns because their job is to make money. And I think when you think about your question from that lens, from a government perspective, from a people perspective, right? We can look and say, wow, there's these deposits in Coeur d'Alene. Why don't we just mine there? It's safer, it's better infrastructure. But then we look at Perpetua Resources, and it might be far cheaper for them to mine in this specific location. Might be cheaper for them to lobby the Idaho government as they have to change 2 critical environmental protections in Idaho that will affect the rest of the state. I just wrote a very long paper on this. It might just be cheaper. And I think that if we expect mines to think in a broader perspective than just making money, we're asking too much of them. And that's where the government is supposed to come in. So I really appreciate your maybe proposed solution, because I think that would put on the government an oversight role of where are deposits, how should we mine them? But that also might create a bigger government, which is contrary to a lot of people's views, I would say, particularly in North Idaho. So I don't know if they hate anyone more than they hate the feds. So that kind of creates a set of interesting issues. And I do think you're right that we should look at where deposits are, how do we mine them strategically. That's also a really huge task and an expensive task. And Lord knows what agency would handle it because we have, I don't know, like 20 different agencies that touch every single mine every day. I'll also just flag from like a legal standpoint, that would be really difficult with the current 1872 mining law, because the way it works right now is that you just have to find public land that hasn't been staked, and you literally stick a physical stake at all 4 corners of your claim. They still drop them from like helicopters. That is quite literally how you stake a mining claim in Idaho and in the country, which is like nuts, but that's how you do it. So it's really not a matter of like the government saying strategically, here's these deposits. It's companies saying, how do I make money? I'm just going to drop a ton of stakes out of a helicopter, hope they land. So it's kind of hard to shift that. And then just as a tangential point, it is my contention that Stibnite's mining there because they are being protective of their other mining claims on the Frank Church Wilderness. They have several claims in the Frank Church that they could competitively kind of keep hold of with the location of that mine. It's also like in a socially strategic position because you've got a small community that could benefit from those jobs. It's always been a mining community. You're close enough to McCall to build a road there, but you're not so close that it's really going to affect those people. I mean, socially, politically, monetarily, it's a very strategic position, unless you're Salmon or someone that likes rivers or trees or public health or Idaho's legislature not being lobbied. So yeah, I think that's a long answer to a long question, but your proposal has a lot of merit, but it involves a lot of different considerations. Do we want more government oversight? Do we want to change that law? How do we want mines to go about it? Do we expect them to be accountable to more than their investors? Do we want mines to be really thinking about environmental laws? Rachel raised last week that there's mines in Canada that are really incorporating tribal perspectives. I personally think there's a lot of value in that. Some people don't. Yeah, that's another soapbox. It's all values driven. That's my long answer to a short question. Perfect.
All right, we had our kind of second discussion question that kind of builds upon what I kind of want to ask. We're having this trade-off between stricter environmental regulations in the US, but that can also unintentionally shift environmental harm to countries with weaker protections. I think that's pretty agreeable.
Yeah.
But how do you think policymakers are addressing this trade-off between making mining safe within the US, but not exporting it to countries with weaker protections?
Ooh, I'll do a caveat and then I'll answer that. Someone raised in the chat something that I actually do want to flag. They raised in the chat that there's very sophisticated mines overseas that are equally as protective, if not more, than some American mines. I don't want to say that like only American mines are good. I actually would not say that. I specifically talk about like third world countries where we've exported our harms to. I do not purport any views or opinions on very sophisticated mines, just because I'm not familiar with it. I've done studies on mines in Taliban-owned uranium mines. I've visited Namibian mines. I've done some studying on DRC in South Africa. So I speak primarily to mines where we are exporting those harms. Quite honestly, I don't think the government's really concerned about that. Because I think, and maybe I want to be clear, like this is just my perspective. This isn't like I'm not basing it on anyone. From my perspective, America has taken a very isolationist approach since the 70s. I don't think the government is sitting around thinking about how we are exporting public health harms possibly to third world developed countries. I think that's evidenced. I mean, we got rid of US aid. We've canceled a whole lot of contracts with really great humanitarian organizations overseas that were federal government funded. And as of now, the American government is taking, like I said, a very isolationist approach. We're not really considering those communities overseas and balancing that trade-off at all. I think it is the duty of a government if we are creating harm overseas. It is my personal perspective that it's our duty to clean up the messes that we make. If American companies are going overseas and creating communities along like the Namibian West Coast and then just leaving them and leaving entire communities to just be without a huge economic leg of their community, I think that's a problem. The current administration would disagree with me. I think they're taking a very isolationist approach to the messes that we make. I don't know if that answers your question. I just don't think we're handling that. I don't think we are balancing that trade-off. I think we should be. I just don't think we are. We've got quite a bit of problems going on in our own backyard right now.
Next two questions we take from remote, from online. That will bring it back in here. The first is by Dr. Virginia Gilliman. Virginia, would you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
I could talk to you for hours about stibnite because I spent about 3 years working on it up there. But at any rate, I'm not Gen Z. I lived through the 70s energy crisis. I've worked on critical mineral statutes from the 1950s, which were maybe more reasonable than what's going on now. So I have a bit more of a historical perspective that a lot of these issues have been around for several hundred years. But how does Gen Z, because you're right, Gen Z is going to have to come up with something, convince politicians and the public to come up with a better legal framework for issues, we'll say mining, mineral, environmental issues that have been here for a century without success. About 40 years ago, there was a serious effort in Congress to start revamping the 1872 mining law. In the end, it never went anywhere. And the mining companies were actually kind of leading that, even though there was plenty of disagreements. But ultimately, it's been Congress and a variety of administrations from the White House that have botched things up. And right now, I think China's way ahead of us and a number of other countries as well. So for all you Gen Zers out there, pay attention to the news, and how do you propose to resolve some of these problems, which are as much political as technical?
Oh boy. That's a very good question. Thank you for that. I think that this question gets back at why I personally care about this problem. And I think I have 2 points to it. Number one, I think, again, that Gen Z is uniquely positioned to tackle it because we have access to an unprecedented amount of data and perspective on the issue. I think politics works entirely differently than it used to, just on the sheer amount of data and communication. And I think with that, I guess I can only speak for myself. As a Gen Z person facing a lot of world issues and waking up every day and wondering how in the world am I going to pay my student loans, let alone like solve the world's problems, I think a lot about how every issue is interconnected, right? I can't buy a house because the stock market's nuts or, however that works. I don't really do money. I can't do all of that, and it somehow all ties to someone's human rights violations in another country. It's all interconnected. And I think that because we view things as interconnected, my personal position is that the more interconnected a problem is, the more interconnected a solution has to be. And I think because we have access to that sheer amount of data and perspective, I think there will be more creative solutions. I don't know that I have Succinct solution. I do think that the Fast 41 program offers a interesting, I think it offers potential. I think a dashboard for infrastructure projects makes sense to me, tracking permitting and in one centralized location, when right now, I mean, like I said, we have like 20 different agencies. I can't even tell you the amount of research that went into writing my one paper on just like one permit for Stibnite because of how many agencies and how many like papers go into that. I think a dashboard makes sense. I think having a royalty system like we do for oil and gas, I think that makes sense. I think it's actually quite insane that we don't have royalties for critical minerals. I also have personal thoughts on like who should have the authority to make these decisions. I think that right now, because we keep them within the agencies, it creates more litigation risk than if Congress would just take some actions. I also think there is a lot to learn from so many different pushes to change the 1872 mining law. I think the sentiment of that law was based on how do miners work together then and how does that work? And I think it works differently now. I don't think the law stands anymore. So I don't know that I have a succinct answer to your question. I think that we already have a lot of really good ideas to work on, like a dashboard or royalties or the efforts put forth in the 90s. But I also have a lot of faith in my peers. I mean, I think we just heard a really great idea of having more government oversight of where we mine deposits. I think there's a lot of really nuanced people in Gen Z that have really great ideas that have never been considered before. Maybe that's just my hope for my generation, but I think the amount of data we have available and the interconnectedness in which we view the world really, really aids that. So I have hope. That's my soapbox answer to that one.
Thank you. My only comment is to all the other Gen Zers in the room, go vote.
A good comment.
We have a second question from online by Denny Dobbin, but I believe this is quite overlapping the same. But Devin, if you another question, please ask it now.
No, that seems like that Faith's answer just really hit the mark, and it just seems to me that the values of the Gen Z should be driving changes in legislation.
For contributing that, and we have a question here in the room, John.
Hey, so I'm wondering if you know or what your thoughts on who, as we want to like import domestically these jobs for not just mining but processing and manufacturing, is it the government's responsibility to find the workers to work those jobs and to train them? Because I'd imagine it's a pretty substantial investment to rally up the troops to work those jobs. They're pretty mature industries in some of these other countries in China and Taiwan and South Korea. How is the government planning on stepping in to make that happen, or is it more the company's responsibilities? They're just leashing the companies back in and telling them, hey, go, now you got to figure it out too.
I think about the interaction between corporate America and America as like a lawsuit. In a lawsuit, both sides bring their absolute strongest claims, and then it's up to the judge in the middle to determine like, okay, what's actually going on, and they kind of whittle claims down until we eventually get to a decision, right? And I think about corporate America and America as a tug like that. I personally think it's the government's role to protect the economic stability of its people. I think that's not everybody's perspective. I think it's mine. And I think that there's ways to do that without just creating like government jobs, right? I mean, if you really want to get into it, I think if we think back to when college used to be significantly cheaper. I was actually just talking to Denny, who just asked the question about the price of college when he went versus me. And the government used to subsidize college. And when that happened, everybody and their mom went to college, and that was great. That was an investment in the American people's development. And I think we see countries like China and Taiwan doing the same thing. I don't see why we couldn't do that with blue collar workers. If we have such a need for manufacturing, we can subsidize companies to create those jobs. There are ways of controlling companies to do that. I think that creates a difficult tug of war. And that also begs the question of like, what I call the college crisis. I mean, everybody's in college and there's just not enough blue collar workers. So how do we incentivize people to take those blue collar jobs while also making the world affordable enough for them to take that? And I think that if it all comes down to, I think if extractive industries is so tied to affordability in that way and so tied to blue collar work and that stability of that market, I think it is the government's role to police companies in that way. But like I said, I don't think that's everybody's role. I think a lot of people think that corporate America should be entirely their own thing and they should run the ropes and they should do that. But I never hold companies to more than making money, and that's worked out pretty well for my values. I never have high expectations of them other than that. So I think it's the government's role, but I think a lot of people have higher hope for companies than that. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have a lot of like succinct answers to like your guys' really tough questions. It all comes down to like who wants what and when.
So that was a very, very, very rich discussion. Thank you everybody for contributing with questions and participating of online and in the room. And let's give another round of applause and thank you for Faith Quigley.
Thanks for having me, guys. Oh, and I will say, if any of you are thinking about like law school or the legislature or any of that, I'm happy to chat. I have my email. Okay, maybe I don't have my email. I have my email here. So if you have any questions about any of the things that I do other than this, email me. That's all. Thank you, guys.